Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the PinkUn Norwich City Podcast. I'm Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy Davitt. We're here, obviously, in the Netherlands, following Norwich City's pre-season tour. I'm delighted to say we're joined by Norwich City's new first-team coach, Ryan Garry. Ryan, thank you so much for your time and taking time out of what is a very busy camp and schedule to chat to us. I guess that's a nice place to start. How's the week been so far?
Good, thank you, and obviously thank you for the invitation to speak. No, listen, the camp's been good so far. Obviously, we're approaching our second week here. Obviously, 2 games on the Saturday that was really good for all the players involved, and really looking forward to the second half of the camp this week.
We've got plenty to chat to you about. The way we're going to... we've already explained this to Ryan, but we'll explain it to the people watching and listening. We're going to do... Basically, the first half will be about your journey and your story in coaching, because I think it's fascinating, having sort of researched it and looked into it. And then obviously we'll do a little bit on Norwich. So, player at Arsenal, Bournemouth as well. That journey into coaching, talk to me about sort of the early years and the first steps into it.
Yeah, I think for me, my coaching journey probably started... Well, it did start as a player. Unfortunately for me, I found myself injured quite a bit with a difficult injury when I was at Arsenal, and it was during that period that I started looking at coaching. Because I love the game, I love watching it, I love playing it, and I would say really that's where my journey started. And then a little bit later on in my career, once I'd left Arsenal and went to Bournemouth, often when I could really, depending on when we had games and what our schedule was, I would just try and take, local teams in the area, really, just, one evening a week, really. And it sort of grew from there. And then I suppose really it got to a point where, I didn't know that I was going to have to retire, but I did. And then the transition into coaching really started there at Bournemouth. So I thought it was going to be a role that would be me working with the Centre of Excellence as it was at the time. Now it would be an academy, but it was actually as a first team coach. So obviously at the time, Bournemouth were in League One. And that was, my introduction to coaching. But obviously prior to that moment, I'd done, a lot of different hours with different groups, the college at Paul College, some of the academy teams, if you like, under 15s, under 13s, under 12s, and sort of would try to do different sessions with different groups, really. That was when I was playing. It feels like it's a long time ago now.
Yeah, and like you say, I think when you look into what you've done, there's a real variety of roles that you've held. I was reading a little bit about private schools and kind of coaching those as well. So those experience sort of as you look back on that journey, I guess have probably helped you deal with lots of different types of players from all sorts of backgrounds and nationalities and whatnot. Yeah,
I think quite early on in that journey of doing different sessions, it was obvious that to me personally, that coaching was, ultimately about connecting with people and, trying to understand the why, the why that they find themselves there. And obviously, as you can imagine, there's a real difference, right, between maybe doing something at Paul College versus being in the Centre of Excellence as it was at Bournemouth. No different than, finding yourself now working with, senior players at a different stage of their career. So it's always, for me, going to be about, understanding the person and where they're at on their journey. And everyone's different. And I think if you've got, an understanding of them, it gives you a chance to work out, okay, how do I connect with this individual, get to know them, but also work out how to help them as a player as well.
Do you think, Ryan, coaching was something you would have always gravitated towards, or was it because your career maybe ended sooner than you would have liked it to, that maybe you felt a little bit unfulfilled on the playing side and you almost wanted to have another crack at it, as it were, in football?
I think it's something that I would have gravitated towards purely off of I'd always be reading about football, watching football, when I wasn't training or playing myself. So there was always a love for the game. And then I think that it was the next best thing. If you're not able to play or train because you're injured, you watch it. I mean, I can remember watching a lot of first team sessions when I was out for the best part of 2.5, 3 years at Arsenal, and I just found it interesting, really. And also, I think it was probably at that time a way for me to stay connected with the group of players that I was with. So, yeah, looking back, I think that, that love and passion for the game has always been there. And I'm, feel blessed that, having had a playing career, I've been able to then develop a coaching career at the same time after.
Ben Napper's sort of told us a little anecdote that very early in your coaching path that, you mentioned Bournemouth and League One. That was Eddie Howe, if I'm right in saying.
Yeah.
And that Eddie maybe clearly spotted something in you in terms of coaching and involved you in more of a first team environment. I mean, is that how it played out, that very, very early on in your trajectory, you found yourself working with first team players?
Yeah, so what happened was, at the time, so Eddie was the manager, and Eddie had left to go to Burnley, and then the new manager was Lee Bradbury, who was a player. And then it was with Lee that I started to get involved with, and it started just going to watch one of the opposition teams that we was going to play as almost like a scouting mission. And then sort of as things then evolved, that's when at the point where I had to retire, then I was able to, take up an invitation to stay on as, one of the coaches there. But originally I thought it was going to be working in the academy. So yeah, it was at Bournemouth, and I think that you need ultimately to be ready for opportunities, no different than when you're a player. And the timing for me was at a good point, and I'm really grateful for that.
Did you find it a challenge dealing with your peers in many respects? Because I guess as a coach, you have to have that detachment almost element as well. That must be a tricky balance when you've only kind of been in the same changing room with these guys.
Yeah. It was strange, really, in a sense of I didn't feel uncomfortable with it, but I remember there was a situation where there was a few of us on the team that had sort of young babies, and in that sort of coming season, there was like a situation where my wife had been invited to the birthday party of one of the little ones, and I was going to be there, but I was like, should I be there? As a player, I wouldn't have thought anything of it, but I did run it past Lee, and he said, yeah, no problem. And I think it's, ultimately it's about being aware of, things do have to change, in terms of that coach or player to coach situation, as you say. But it's one that you ultimately have to make if you want to do the job correctly, I believe. So yeah, it's funny, I've forgotten about that moment. But there are moments where I think, with time in the role from player to coach, that sort of just evolves, and then it becomes second nature for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just to bring you back to sort of the Arsenal stuff, and you said they're watching sessions. I mean, that would have been around the time of a very good Arsenal team, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So some of those players, and it's interesting you say that, you were watching it as a player, but actually looking back on it, it's kind of helped you from a coaching perspective.
Yeah, I mean, obviously at that time, Arsenal were, and they are at the moment, it's a very, very big club. And again, I feel, lucky in the fact that I was probably as a player educated well, and in a sense, watching, that level of player train, originally primarily at that stage, it was to, when I get back, I want to be challenging these guys, and, how can you can pick up loads from watching Ashley Cole, for instance, who at the time was, in England, senior international, I think, in my opinion, one of the best left backs of his generation, not just in England, but in terms of, world football, European football for me. And you can pick up loads of little things from that level of player, all over the pitch. And certainly, it was a challenging time professionally in terms of being a player, because, ultimately I wanted to play, but actually looking back now, there was a lot of learning that took place, from the sidelines, watching those sessions, watching what was probably the for me, like the basics of some of those players were very, very high level. And then, ultimately a manager who, developed many players, in many different clubs, different continents, even, in terms of what Arsenal did in Japan.
Yeah, and that was what I was going to say. We've been about top level players, but also we've mentioned Eddie Howe, Arsene Wenger. There's some really big coaching influences there as well.
Huge. I mean, I had Don Howe as one of the youth team coaches, Neil Banfield, who, very, very experienced developers of young men and players, like you say, Arsene and Eddie. These are people that are very good at what they do. And, I'll be grateful for, what I learned from them as a player, but also in that sort of transition into coaching as well.
Was there ever a period along the way, like you say, that the fact that maybe it came a little bit earlier than you expected, where you sort of felt this is what I want to do, or was it instant, that sort of feeling as soon as you stepped into it?
I think probably, I'll reference those earlier sessions. Even when I was playing, I enjoyed it. I kept going back. I found it really fascinating, the difference you get with different groups at different levels. So I had a curious mind, and I remember thinking, if Wimbledon Town, for instance, who are a part-time team, how can I make a session that they enjoy? Just like how can I make the kids at Paul College like this session? And understanding what they ultimately are turning up to the session for, because you want them to enjoy it. And that's no different than what we would do with the boys here. We want to put on sessions that A, they enjoy, B, make them better, and, make sure that the environment's right for them. So, and I enjoyed that. I really did. So that was probably, looking back, the stage where I was like, right, I like coaching, and it's something that I'd like to do full time when the time comes. When I finished playing, I just obviously didn't realise it was going to be that soon.
I mean, you mentioned earlier about trying to find the why within players. What was your why in terms of coaching? Is it that connectivity that you spoke about?
I think, I did a lot of different sports when I was younger, but I always loved team sports. So I think it is being part of a team I enjoy, trying to help develop people. I think when you're coaching as well, there's an element of you're trying to help people as well. And that's probably something that I took from my coaches as well, because I think looking back, it wasn't just the on-grass stuff. It was also, trying to develop, me as a young man. And I think that if you can, help people in general, and it's playing football, working in football, it's a blessing.
And obviously Arsenal features heavily in your story, both as a player and as a coach, because we're obviously starting that journey at Bournemouth. But talk to us a little bit about how that came about. You got the opportunity to go back to Arsenal.
Yeah. So what happened was I did a year as a first team coach at Bournemouth and a reserve team coach. I then left Bournemouth and went to the Nike Academy, which was a really interesting program. So for 11 months of the year, we had a group of players from the age of 17 to 21. And those players had either been released from clubs up and down the pyramid in England, or had won a competition from Nike to earn a spot in the academy. And the sole aim of the academy was to try and get players a contract in England or somewhere else, across the globe. So it was a really interesting program for me. We was based up at Loughborough University, which is obviously the reputation of Loughborough, from an educational perspective is good. In the coaching office, there was many, all the different sporting coaches were in this office. So it was quite interesting to be able to interact with, a hockey coach or a basketball coach or a swimming coach, ask them questions about their program, how they saw development, what did development look like in their environment. So there's a footballing environment, and for instance, an Olympic sport, their processes of development is completely different to football, which is interesting. So I learned a lot there. I worked with a guy called Jimmy Gilligan, who has had a huge influence on me. Again, someone who's worked with many, many different players at different levels and done a lot. And so I did a season there, and then after that, that's when I joined Arsenal. So by this stage, obviously I'd done 2 years of full-time coaching, different age groups, different experiences. And then when I went to Arsenal, I was there for 8 years doing various different roles. And yeah, it was great. Lots of learning, lots of different experiences and again, it's not just football. It could be dealing with, a retain release situation with someone from the age of, the foundation phase or the PDP phase. So the whole range of development, if you like, that 8 years gave me a lot to sort of reflect on, learn, and ultimately, you live it, you breathe it with the parents, with the players. A great time.
So I mean, you can tell already by that trajectory, that path, that you're a very, as an individual, just speaking to you now, you're open to new experiences, and you're not really set in a very narrow kind of, I'm a football coach and I must go on this journey, and it's maybe the traditional steps to wherever you want to get to, it be it a first team environment. Has that always been something in you as a person, that you're open to experiences and almost put yourself out your comfort zone? You talked there about, interacting with other coaches from other different sports.
Yeah, I think, listen, I've got a passion for football. As I said, I think it's a blessing to be working in football as a coach. There's a lot of people, I'm sure, that would want to be involved in football, and I love football. I think that my sort of interpretation on my coaching journey is that lots of different experiences have been invaluable for me in different, different places, and we'll speak about Belgium and the FA in a minute. But I think that ultimately, very similar to a player, you need to have, bandwidth to your experiences to really work out and understand different people, different cultures, different expectancies, and so on. I think having that range does help you ultimately understand that, like, what you might think is ultimately sometimes not the case. Because we all have biases. You have to accept that, and it's just learning about yourself as well in a lot of these situations, because it's a big world. And ultimately, I think if you can have different experiences, you'll get growth.
And to take your point now, you mentioned it. You then had that FA experience. So that from the outside looking in, anything to do with any England team, and you were obviously involved at age group levels there, feels like a lot of pressure, because you're carrying that expectancy of, you're working with the best players at that age group in the country, and the expectation, I guess, whenever England go and compete at that level is that it is England. So how did you find that experience, and did that again provide another layer of development and learning and experience?
Yeah, it certainly did. So I think that for me, like I said, I'd done 8 years at Arsenal in different roles, and probably found myself at a point where I needed to do something different to learn more. I really enjoyed my time at Arsenal, and it's a special club for me, having played there. Played in every age group, and then more or less coached every age group. And then the opportunity to join the FA was one that I wanted to take ultimately to further develop myself. But it is very different to the club environment, which I was attracted to, really, because I think that the role of a national coach, when I was there, was one where you had a few things that you ultimately were responsible for. So you was working with a certain age group. You would also assist with different age groups, because depending on what age group you're with, sometimes there's camps inside the international window, as we would know it, but also there was younger age groups outside. So when you would double up on those as an assistant coach, which gave you an understanding of the broader pathway, which I think is important. There was an element of club engagement as well. So you would go into clubs, maybe it would be sharing some feedback on a player, or a club might invite you in to deliver a session. There was an element of coach education as well. So it's quite a broad range. So, these were experiences that I hadn't had before. Learned an awful lot. And then in terms of like the actual football element, I went in and worked with the 2004 born under 18s. I did that for a year. Then I went and worked with the 2006 born group for the first year as under 17s, and then stayed with them because we qualified for a European Championships and then qualified for a World Cup. So I sort of stayed with that group. So listen, 2.5 years of great times, and it's something that was very different to the club element, if you like. But again, lots of learning, lots of experiences, and good people as well. Some really good experienced people that had operated at different levels that were very engaging, but also shared a lot of their experience.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that point, I guess, like you say a couple of times, very different to club level. How did you find kind of the time constraints? It's a very different type of development, isn't it? Because when you're at a club, you've got not an infinite amount of time. You've got a lot of time to develop a player and a person.
Yeah.
Whereas internationally, that window is naturally a lot smaller.
Yeah, to be honest with you, that was one of the things. So I remember thinking, what does it feel like not to be working on the grass, if you like, 6 or 7 days a week? And it was uncomfortable for the first 6 weeks. I remember going home and saying to my wife, I'm not sure, like, it didn't feel what I was used to. And that again is growth, right? You have to feel uncomfortable at times. But then I got used to the rhythm of how it would work as a national coach. And then it's funny, actually, today I was saying to John, the kit man, that because he was asking me, how does it work? Does this camp look and feel like it would on an international camp? And I said, in a way, in terms of you could have 2 or 3 games. There's an element of travel. There's an element of like, when's the game? What's the travel look like? Who's in the group? And I think probably the biggest learning for me was obviously working in a real intense period for sort of 10 days on the camps, and then what goes into the planning and what goes into the execution, because it's completely different to the club landscape, and also as well the context of knowing the individual as well. So at Arsenal or Bournemouth or the Nike Academy, you're connecting with people daily, whereas at the FA you're living with someone potentially for 10 days, and then you might not see them. If you go from the November to the March window, there's like a big gap, and there's an awful lot that can happen in that gap, good, bad and indifferent, and then trying to reconnect, and obviously you would try and reconnect, you would see players between camps, but ultimately it was a completely different rhythm to the club world, if you like. So I'm really, really happy that I've experienced both. But that role, going back to what you were saying about, what is the role? The role is ultimately to try and help, not just the age group that you're working with, but the game, the wider element of the game in this country to be better. Obviously the FA's got huge ambition of winning a major trophy again, and hopefully that comes soon.
Yeah, and I know Gareth Southgate used to speak about this when he was England manager, particularly internationally. A lot of it is about culture and creating that. And is that the stage, and is that the role really where clearly you were a first team coach at Bournemouth, so I'm sure there was an element of it then. But when you began to think about what a team would look like and how you have to build a team and how to slot certain players to balance it and stuff like that, is that sort of in your mind in that role, I guess, for a longer period of time?
Yeah, it is, because I think that ultimately, and this is where the challenge is when you're looking at the area of potential and development is, and especially understand the context of the individual and where they're at. It's very difficult to make a call on someone at such a young age, because there's so much that can happen. Everyone, as I call it, everyone's got different climbs to the mountaintop, if you like, in terms of just making their debut. There's some people that climb very quickly. There's some people that can sometimes be stuck on a ridge, if you like. There's people that go different routes to get to the top. And depending on when you're seeing that individual, it could be they're going through it really quickly. They're stuck on a ledge, if you like. So it's really challenging to sort of make that sort of call. in terms of when you're selecting for a camp. And then obviously, as you can imagine, you're dealing with sometimes a squad of 21, and you've got maybe, this never happened to me, but you can have maybe 15 different clubs represented. So that could be 15 different elements of, club identity, club playing style, methods of working. You chuck in like education slots as well, because we had to make sure that the boys did their education and didn't fall behind. There's a lot to sort of consider before even you get round to like selecting a team. And you want to make sure that you're giving everyone an opportunity on certain camps. Other camps, there's an element where, you need to qualify. So you're consistently thinking, what's best for everyone involved, staff and players. So it really was a great experience. But, as you said, ultimately that, the Gareth Southgate one, thinking, you do an awful lot of that.
Yeah, and I guess for you as a coach, as Paddy said earlier, it's that exposure to top level players. Did you get the same exposure to kind of top level coaches, to Gareth, to someone like Lee Carsley, who clearly has done a very good job with the 21s?
Yeah, both Lee and Gareth were, they're good people, really, really good people. Gareth always had time for everyone. He's really, really invested in the pathway, I've got to say. And he was someone who had obviously a very good playing career for clubs and obviously for his country. But, in terms of the pathway at England, he had done lots of different roles before becoming the head coach of the senior team. And, I genuinely think he was someone that understood the pathway and the journey that the boys were on, and also the coaches as well. So, him and Steve Holland were very proactive in, asking, how was your last camp? How did it go? Asking questions, very open. And then Lee is the under-21s coach, similar. He'd been, he'd worked at club level, he'd worked at international level, different ages as well. And probably knew, because the nature of how the FA works, you can see it now. It's a very fluid pathway, which I think is good. Players are given the opportunity. And there's a lot of focus on what is in the pipeline, because there can be people called up to the seniors. And at actually one stage, Lee came with me to do one of the camps. We went to Georgia, and it was great, to be able to have, the under-21s head coach with us on camp. It was excellent for not just me, but for the players as well, because he was able to, share his experiences from the 21s perspective to the boys, who we would obviously hope there would be some of them that would go from 17s to 19s to 21s, or, in some of the players' cases, you skip out the 19s and go directly to the 21s. So I think, it's important, no different than it would be in a club. Ideally, you want, real connection with different coaches, seeing, who's in what age group.
And what is that balance like in a role like that? Because clearly, as we've kind of spoken around, there's a development aspect, but there's also a winning aspect as well. And as you say, you're going to European Championships and World Cups with a certain age group, with an England team. There is, as Paddy said, kind of a pressure. So how did you manage that balance between development and also winning?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, for me, there's two elements to it. So there's understanding that, you can't solely just look at winning. Again, link back to my answer to one of your questions before, in terms of it's the context of a young player, because there could be a young player who has got huge potential that maybe at this moment in time isn't performing, and understanding that. And I think that's probably where you recall players that you've worked with before and their journey, and sometimes there's snippets of evidence that you go, okay, maybe this isn't the right time to call him up, or maybe it is the right time to call him up. And often in my case, I would speak to, some of the people at the FA, but also inside the club as well, say, look, this is what I'm thinking, what do you think? And you've got to ultimately make decisions for yourself. But I'd always try and extract some information from, other stakeholders, because, that's just how I think you should approach that. And ultimately, if you're talking about winning and qualifying for European Championships or World Cups, I think for me, sometimes people think that all development winning. I think anyone that comes into an England camp is going to want to perform well and win. You just have to accept that sometimes you will and sometimes you won't. But that's development. I think it's probably how you frame it, how you manage that for not just the players, but the staff and the programme. And I think we got a nice balance of that. And I always said to the groups, when we went to the Euros or the World Cup, because we've qualified, it doesn't mean that we've cracked it. And then when we exited both competitions, I said the same thing. This doesn't mean now that, everything's terrible. This is part of being, an elite sportsman. You have to sometimes, brush yourself off and go again. Obviously, the context is for these players at that age, it looks like, okay, you might have to wait for next year's qualification round. But ultimately, use this experience, the good and the bad, as a person and as a player, when they go back to club. Because I think that the FA program can give huge learning moments to these young men, but it will be ultimately what they do in their club that will dictate how far they go in the short to medium term, because that's the environment that they're in daily, if that makes sense. So you just have to try and understand both environments and what can work for that individual the best that you can.
Speak to us about Belgium, because that feels like not only as a football experience, but a life experience. In many respects, brave decision. It's still, you don't still see a lot of English coaches going out abroad, more so than maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. But what was the appeal there? What was the attraction? And then as an experience in the round, how much did you get out of that?
Yeah, listen, I got loads out. I really enjoyed it. I think probably if I go back to when I was playing, I would love to have experienced playing abroad. And obviously that didn't happen. When I played for the younger England age groups, I loved those games because it felt so different. And I can recall playing, certain nations, Germany, Holland, Belgium, Italy, and really being interested, again, that curious mind of like, okay, this is completely different to, playing West Ham or Tottenham or whoever. That's interesting. Didn't get the opportunity to play abroad. And to be honest with you, I would say the me wanting to experience working abroad, it wasn't really on my radar for the first probably 4 years of coaching. And then the first time that it really entered my mind was just as I was going to the FA. Someone from CFG, I had a conversation with them about one of the clubs there, and they just said, you're on the radar. I was like, oh, okay. Means what? Well, means that you're on a radar for potential roles within the group. I was like, oh, okay. And then I was thinking, okay, so that could be wherever in the world. And I always thought, I was interested. Didn't really think anything at the time, because obviously I was thinking about, what I was about to enter with the FA. And again, the FA role, there's exposure to different nations, so got more curious because obviously now I'm operating in, especially on camp where you're playing, different countries. Obviously we went to a Euros, went to a World Cup, and then there was an opportunity to go to Belgium. So the timing's right. So obviously married, got 3 young children. So there's a huge part of the off pitch, if you like, where you've got to consider schools, education. Is it the right thing? I know that I would like to do it. And then the family, I was lucky in the sense that they was comfortable in trying it as well, which was a big thing for me because I'm not too sure if I would have done it if they weren't happy in going, given the sort of the ages of my children and where they was at their life. So it was a big move. And then once they was happy to do it, I was happy to do it. And it was great, loads of learning about me as a person, us as a family, some really enriching life experiences. It wasn't all sort of like happy. It was like some challenging moments as well, naturally. But, I wouldn't change that. And then in terms of the football element, it was really good because it you go from, you're working at Bournemouth, you're working with kids at Paul College, you're working at the Nike Academy, you're working at Arsenal, you're working at the FA. And then all of a sudden you're like trying to have a conversation and there's just blank eyes coming back and you're like, wow, okay. Completely different experience, in terms of how do you connect and how do you learn about the, Belgian football culture, the culture of the club, the culture of development in Belgium. Yeah, huge learnings and really, really insightful place to work as well, because Belgium as a country, it's very different. There's 3 languages spoken in different regions. There's 3 different governments. There's a real fluidity to their culture, if you like, with huge tradition. So there's a real nuance, I think, to understanding you in the north, you in the south, and understanding the history. And then ultimately as well, linking it back to football, there's a real understanding that they need to produce players and they need to trade. So from a development aspect, they work completely different in their methodology, especially when you look at how their younger players are exposed to senior football, which is really interesting and very, very different to what I'd been used to. So it was, really, really good.
You talk about the challenges, and in the footballing sense, there was a spell there where you actually were in charge of the team earlier this year, wasn't it? I mean, in a club environment, first time that would have been the case. And how did you find that?
Yeah, it was in January for 7 games. It was a really challenging situation for the club, where I was asked to sort of step in as an interim manager. I really enjoyed the experience. I think that, I ultimately learnt a lot through some of the challenges that, we had to navigate. I felt that it gave me an opportunity to see it from another side, if you like. And yeah, really, really enjoyed the experience. I think that obviously the context was that we had found ourselves in a really difficult spell. And there was lots of different things going on. I mean, like the transfer window was open during my time there, and a sort of exposure to that was really interesting, and just in terms of the impact a transfer window can have on individuals who, listen, at this age, some of these boys are very young. They are potentially experiencing a big move for the first time, and you sort of really see the emotional load that they've got. They're making big, like, life-changing decisions. And yeah, listen, I really enjoyed the experience. It was tough, but ultimately I think that again, it's learning, really good learning.
Life-changing experiences brings us to where we are now, and obviously the Lommel connection is relevant because Liam Manning started out his senior coaching career. So just why Norwich? I think when the club confirmed the appointment, you said, look, this is a big club. This is a great opportunity to come back to England. So is that how you felt? Was that your outside perception of Norwich as a club, that this could be a great stage for me now in the next stage of my coaching career?
Yeah, listen, there's a few reasons really. It's my history with Norwich is an interesting one. So Norwich was actually the first professional club where I had a training session. So there was like a satellite centre just up, from where I lived, just up the A127. And that was my first exposure to a professional club's training. It'd be like a satellite centre now, I think. And I really enjoyed it. It moved, I think, from just off of the A127 up to Colchester, I think, at the time. And this is when I was probably 8. So unfortunately, I had to stop going. And then that's then when I went to Arsenal. But so I've always been aware of Norwich. I can remember doing, like, there was a tournament at Colney, and this is years ago, and really enjoying the day. So I've been aware of Norwich, as a little one, even though I lived in London. Through the nature of my experiences, whether that was at the Nike Academy or at Arsenal, I'd always had interactions with staff and players at Norwich, always been super impressed with the people, in terms of really nice people, very welcoming. And obviously, everyone's aware that this club has produced many, many, many players, and been really productive in terms of development for me for a number of years. And then it's weird really how things work out. So I've known Liam for probably over 10 years, from when he was at Ipswich, and then obviously then when he moved to West Ham. I'd spoken to Liam off and on in that period, on a range of different things. I was obviously aware when he went to Lommel, because I had spoken to him when he was in America. So we had sort of, exchanged messages, had conversations. And then, when the opportunity to leave Lommel to join Norwich came about, it was a big decision, just like it was a big decision to leave England to go to Lommel. Leaving Lommel was going to be big because my family was settled. I loved the role. I was enjoying the role, and it came out of the blue. But Liam was one thing. Obviously, I'd worked with Ben before when he was at Arsenal in his role as, first off, when he was involved with the first team, but then as loans manager when I was working in the PDP. Ultimately, I think it was a really good opportunity. I really liked the look of what I was hearing, spoke to different people, and there was a lot of consistency in terms of, what the project was about, which I think is hugely important with good people, in a nice part of the world. So it was a big decision to make, and one that I wanted to take.
Well, and with Liam, like you say, you've known him for a long period of time. Has there been opportunities in the past to work together? And clearly it's a timing factor as well now. So does it feel like this has been a long time coming in terms of joining a staff that he sort of heads up?
Yeah. So I sort of, and this is going back many, many years ago when he was at West Ham, there was a few opportunities, and probably the timing then wasn't right. Obviously the timing is right now. And I think that, the project, working with Liam, who's someone I've got a lot of respect for, is a good guy, and seeing and hearing about what my role would entail, it was one that I was really interested to explore, and one that I'm really looking forward to getting going on, and ultimately, my role is to support him and Chris as best as I can, because I think they've proven over a number of years that they're a very good technical team. Obviously, I want to support them and help them as much as I can. And then obviously the part where you've got, the individual development for, a first team squad, where there's a lot of difference within the squad in terms of what that individual development looks like. I can't wait to get started on.
Yeah, you spoke about Liam and Chris, and as you say, worked together a long period of time. They clearly have an understanding. So what's it been like kind of stepping into that and trying to add and support what has already been a very successful sort of partnership that they've had at a number of different clubs? Yeah,
I've really enjoyed it. They've been very welcoming. I'm very, I think very mindful in trying to make sure that I'm clear on what they want, but also how they work. So obviously I've got to make sure that I'm not interrupting that. I've got to look to try and add to that. And I'm sure the more that we work together, that will solidify. But yeah, I've really enjoyed it. I think the camp has been good for that, and obviously the work that we did back at the training centre has been good for that as well. And I'm really hopeful that we can have a really positive year. The energy that I've only been here 3 weeks, but the energy and the vibes that I've observed, I've been really impressed with. Everyone's come back in good condition, has been really hungry to get going with the football. Obviously, we're in week 3 now, so we're sort of like the middle point. And, although there's a lot of work to do, I think there's been some really good examples of certainly the culture that Liam's going after, playing out, and hopefully that will continue.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a dynamic, because I think you hear from other head coaches, and every head coach works differently, that sometimes there's units and coaches take different units. Is that going to be the case for you, or is it slightly more fluid and dynamic than that?
I think it's slightly more fluid and dynamic, but that could also come into play. Obviously, at the moment, for myself, I'm getting used to a new group of staff and a new group of players. Obviously, for the gaffer and Hoggy, they're also getting used to a new club, new set of players. James Krause, obviously, they've worked with before. So, we're all trying to work out how we can best support each other. And, a pre-season program is also very different to an in-season program. It's a really good block of time, I think, to obviously get working with a new squad and meet people and see how things go. But, ultimately we're working towards, and it is a performance environment because, we're here to win games. And what we've got to make sure that we do as a staff is make sure that the program that we provide is the best for every player, whether you're an experienced first team player or you're an academy player who's in and around the first team. And that's the other thing I think it's worth mentioning, is that obviously here at the moment we've got the first team and we've got some players from the professional development phase. And as you've seen in the games, we've finished the games with a young academy team, if you like. And there's not many clubs where that would be the case, where first team and the academy are together. So it's been really good for me also to be able to see some of the academy boys as well and speak to the academy staff.
Only because you preempted one of the points I was going to come back to. With your youth development background, and I appreciate it is only 3 weeks in, but because you've had that opportunity to look at very close quarters the work that they've done in the development phase here, do you feel that there's some real good talent in that group? And obviously we all appreciate that, as you said, that the great analogy about the mountaintop and different players will progress at different stages. But can you see, even in these 3 weeks and now working with this group in the last 2 games and the last few days, that there's a lot of good work gone in at that academy?
I think so. And I've been aware of the work that's gone in prior to me being here, because obviously, especially working at Arsenal, we would often play Norwich, and then being at the FA, being able to come in a few times, and speaking to some players and some academy staff, I've seen, the program from the outside, if you like, and I've always been impressed by it. And in terms of what I've seen here, and I am mindful, obviously, that we're speaking 3 weeks into pre-season, and again, for the younger players, that can sometimes bring huge stress because they're physically experiencing a hard pre-season for only the first or second time, and some of the boys, aren't fully maturated, so the demand is big. In terms of, understanding that and seeing start point, end point, like us, they're only 3 weeks in. So I've been really impressed. I think to finish 2 games in the manner that they did, especially on the weekend against the Belgium second division champions, and the manner in how they played, I think it's very positive and a testament to the work that's gone on for, in some cases, some of these boys have been here from under 8s, so there's a huge element of work and effort that goes in, and I'm only seeing them on this point. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to work with the younger players. And I think, to probably finish the question off, I think it's important to understand that Norwich has a good academy, and like I said, has always had players in the pipeline. And it's just, ultimately understanding, when is the right time for someone to step into a first team space. And it's important, I was speaking to Ding this morning at breakfast just about like the timing of that. and understanding how to navigate that, which is probably like the hardest moment for an academy. The sort of the stakeholders around the plan. I'm not talking about parents or advisors or agents, but just the club staff, because it's a very delicate situation, because they're getting exposed to senior football, which can be unforgiving, and they're still developing, physically, mentally, emotionally as well, and it's important that you're the pre and post understanding of that journey is correct.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you on a similar theme. Really, it's clear you look at your career; it's been about development, but also the institutions that you've worked for, CFG, the FA, Arsenal. Clearly, development is something that you're very passionate about, and this is a club, clearly, as you've mentioned a few times, that in recent history and in longer history have always kind of favoured that. So you yourself must feel very aligned with kind of what's going on here on a wider level.
Yeah, for sure. So, I'll take it back to, my conversations with Liam and Ben on, especially Liam. And I knew this from working with Liam, he's also a developer. And if you look at, some of the work that he's done at his previous clubs in terms of development, it's been excellent. Whether that's with a younger player or, a mid-20s or 30 or mid-30s player. Ben, similar. In terms of the project here around working with younger players and the history of the club, like I said before, in terms of some of the players that have come through here, and then even speaking to Mark, when he was here earlier on this week, a great guy that ultimately wants to help people. He seemed very positive about the project, about the club, and the ambitions that he's got around developing and improving people. So the alignment piece for me, and I go back to that, in terms of your question, I think, everyone's aligned on that. And that's really important, because it isn't, it's a huge task and challenge to develop people, let alone players. But I think the environment here is one that can do that for sure.
How much are you looking forward to a championship season, experiencing the intensity of that?
Yeah, very much so. I was actually saying this to someone, because obviously in Belgium, there's like one game a week, and you get used to that rhythm and that pace. And then this is going to be like back in the, the Bournemouth days where you got Saturday, Tuesday. But no, listen, I'm really looking forward to it, because, the champion. One of the things that I learned from being in living in Belgium is the uniqueness of the English football pyramid. And we're very lucky to have, the understanding of the English football pyramid and the strength and, ultimately the depth. Just speaking to a lot of people in Belgium, and they ask questions about this club, that club, and they sometimes struggle to get their mind around, the attendances that you can get in League Two. And the size of some of the clubs and the history of some of the clubs. It's something that they don't have, and it's a great league. It's a fantastic league that has lots of twists and turns, a lot of demands, in every element. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'm hopeful that we are in a position to have a really solid pre-season, and that gives us the foundation to go into the first game of the season in, really good shape, not just physically, but mentally as well.
Final one for me, and I'll let Paddy have a couple to finish. But you mentioned that intensity. Is there a coaching challenge that comes to that? When it's a Saturday, Tuesday, the coaching time can be more limited. What's that going to be like as a challenge? Is that something you've sort of experienced previously with that intensity of games?
I've experienced it at the FA, where you can have a game every second or third day. And that's just something that, I think that we will be mindful of. Obviously, Liam's experiences in the Championship last year, you've got a minimum of 50 games, and it's understanding the group ultimately. So, it's really important that we are mindful of where the group are at, like you said, and we've spoken about that as a coaching staff. Obviously, pre-season, the sessions, the weeks can look very, very different, because we're ultimately bringing people up to speed and embedding a lot of, ideas in the methodology. I think that as you then enter the season, you've got Saturday, Tuesday, like you say, you've got maybe some injuries, some niggles, some suspensions. You're bringing players in, and it's about understanding the group. And I think that Liam's going to be able to do that very well. He showed that last year, and that's why the connection bit I think is important to build that in, because it's ultimately it's two-way. It's the players and the coaching staff being on the same page with what the demands are and making sure that we meet those.
I mean, I just want to finish on a personal note, really. I mean, you were saying to us before we started recording, your wife and your family haven't joined you in Norfolk yet, but how much are you looking as a family to sort of experience living in Norfolk, in Norwich? I'm assuming in the first 3 weeks you've had very little downtime to go and experience it.
Yeah, no, first off, I'm really looking forward to it. So Carla and the boys are going to be coming over on Friday. And then obviously they're going to be arriving and we're on camp, but we'll move into our place on Monday. So I'm really, we're really looking forward to that. I've had the opportunity to go into the town twice. Really enjoyed it. I think first off, looks like it's a really vibrant city, lots to do, lots to explore. So no, we're really looking forward to it. And then obviously you've got the element of the beautiful countryside, you've got the coast, there's a lot going on. And probably they'll experience it more than me because, obviously we're busy. But no, I think, from my perspective, you make professional decisions ultimately because of the club first. And then I think it's an added bonus when you factor in, all those elements that I've just spoken about. And yeah, listen, I think as a family, we're really looking forward to a next chapter in Norwich and Norfolk.
Wish you the best with that.
But
thank you.
I was going to say there must be you're also an adopted Norfolker.
Yeah, okay.
There must be recommend a beach to Ryan that he can visit.
No, you're
many
the Norfolk
ones.
one on this panel, Connor. I mean, if
Norfolk, I'm thinking there's a lot of nice ones.
Well, if I was, Holcombe would be the one. Sea Pauling. I mean, all of these are Ryan's thinking what are these two talking about here, but you'll find out in due course.
Do you know what? There's been a lot of right.
You must
advise you go
here.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to certainly getting to know the area, getting to know the beaches, and the next time we speak, I'll tell you what I think without trying to upset anyone.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Good man, Ryan. Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you, Pad. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for watching and listening as well, and we'll see you again very soon.